Welcome to AristotleWalks, where amazing philosophy papers are read aloud. The YouTube portion's aim is to make philosophy more accessible, specifically for those with vision impairments. Today, I will be reading a fantastically relevant essay, Collective Responsibility by Hannah Arendt, published 1987, but written sometime between 1968 and 1975. I switch out the term Negro in her original essay for Black. Let's get started. Although I agree with what I think are the two main statements of Mr. Feinberg's paper, I must admit that I had some difficulty with it. My agreement concerns his firm distinction between guilt and responsibility. Collective responsibility, he says, is a special case of vicarious responsibility, and there can be no such thing as vicarious guilt. End quote. In other words, there is such a thing as responsibility for things one has not done. One can be held liable for them. But there is no such thing as being or feeling guilty for things that happened without oneself actively participating in them. This is an important point, worth making loudly and clearly at a moment when so many good white liberals confess to guilt feelings with respect to the black question. I don't know how many precedents there are in history for such misplaced feelings, but I do know that in post-war Germany, where similar problems arose with respect to what had been done by the Hitler regime to Jews, the cry, "We are all guilty," that at first hearing sounded so very noble and tempting, has actually only served to exculpate to a considerable degree those who actually were guilty. Where all are guilty, nobody is. Guilt, unlike responsibility, always singles out. It is strictly personal. It refers to an act, not to intentions or potentialities. It is only in a metaphorical sense that we can say we feel guilty for the sins of our fathers or our people or mankind, in short, for deeds we have not done, although the course of events may well make us pay for them. And since sentiments of guilt, mens rea, or bad conscience, the awareness of wrongdoing, play such an important role in our legal and moral judgment, it may be wise to refrain from such metaphorical statements which, when taken literally, can only lead into a phony sentimentality in which all real issues are obscured. Mr. Feinberg himself, I am afraid, sometimes comes dangerously close to undoing his own clear distinction when he introduces the notion of sympathetic identification, stating that any feeling one person can experience can be experienced vicariously by some other imaginatively sensitive person. End quote. If this were true, then there would indeed be such a phenomenon as vicarious guilt feeling. But Mr. Feinberg also has his doubts about this. An authentically vicarious feeling, if there can be such a thing, end quote. We call compassion what I feel when somebody else suffers, and this feeling is authentic only so long as I realize that it is, after all, not I, but somebody else who suffers. But it is true, I think, that solidarity is a necessary condition for such emotions, which, in our case of collective guilt feelings, would mean that the cry, "We are all guilty," is actually a declaration of solidarity with the wrongdoers. I don't know when the term collective responsibility first made its appearance, but I am reasonably sure that not only the term, but also the problems it implies, owe their relevance and general interest to political predicaments as distinguished from legal or moral ones. My difficulty with Mr. Feinberg's paper is not that he omits this dimension of the question. He discusses political problems in the last part of his paper, but that he tries from the beginning to construe all issues according to models which are either legally or morally relevant, so that the political issue appears to be not more than a special case of matters that are subject to normal legal proceedings or normal moral judgments. Mr. Feinberg distinguishes between legal and moral standards. Moral standards are stricter than standards of legal culpability. The distinction, he thinks, is a matter of degree. I am not sure that I would altogether agree. Gambling, for instance, is legally wrong, at least in this country. Although I am not a professional gambler, my moral standards in this matter are considerably less strict. But I do agree that legal and moral standards have one very important thing in common. They always relate to the person and what the person has done. If the person happens to be involved in a common undertaking, as in the case of organized crime, what is to be judged is still this very person, the degree of his participation, his specific role, and so on, and not the group. The fact of his membership plays a role only insofar as it makes his having committed a crime more probable, and this is in principle not different from bad reputation or having a criminal record. Whether the defendant was a member of the mafia or a member of the SS or some other criminal or political organization, assuring us that he was a mere cog who acted only upon superior orders and did what everybody else would have done just as well, the moment he appears in a court of justice, he appears as a person and is judged according to what he did. It is the grandeur of court proceedings that even a cog can become a person again. And the same seems true to an even higher degree for moral judgment, for which the excuse, my only alternative would have led to suicide, is not as binding as it is for legal proceedings. It is not a case of responsibility, but of guilt. It seems to me that Mr. Feinberg, by the choice of his models, blurs the very distinction between responsibility and guilt, which was his own point of departure. No collective responsibility is involved in the case of the 1,000 experienced swimmers lolling at a public beach and letting a man drown in the sea without coming to his help, because they were no collectivity to begin with. No collective responsibility is involved in the case of conspiracy to rob a bank, because here the fault is not vicarious. What is involved are various degrees of guilt. And if, as in the case of the postbellum Southern social system, only the alienated residents or the outcasts are innocent, we have again a clear-cut case of guilt, for all the others have indeed done something which is by no means vicarious. Still following Mr. Feinberg's argument, I would say that two conditions have to be present for collective responsibility. I must be held responsible for something I have not done, and the reason for my responsibility must be my membership in a group, a collective, which no voluntary act of mine can dissolve. That is, a membership which is utterly unlike a business partnership, which I can dissolve at will. The question of contributory group faults must be left in abeyance, because every participation is already non-vicarious. This kind of responsibility, in my opinion, is always political, whether it appears in the older form, when a whole community takes it upon itself to be responsible for whatever one of its members has done, or whether a community is being held responsible for what has been done in its name. The latter case is, of course, of greater interest for us because it applies, for better and worse, to all political communities and not only to representative government. Every government assumes responsibility for the deeds and misdeeds of its predecessors, and every nation for the deeds and misdeeds of the past. This is even true for revolutionary governments, which may deny liability for contractual agreements their predecessors have entered into. When Napoleon Bonaparte became the ruler of France, he said, "I assume responsibility for everything France has done from the times of Charlemagne to the terror of Robespierre." In other words, he said, "All this was done in my name, to the extent that I am a member of this nation and the representative of this body politic." In this sense, we are always held responsible for the sins of our fathers as we reap the rewards of their merits. But we are, of course, not guilty of their misdeeds, either morally or legally, nor can we ascribe their deeds to our own merits. We can escape this political and strictly collective responsibility only by leaving the community, and since no man can live without belonging to some community, this would simply mean to exchange one community for another, and hence one kind of responsibility for another. It is true that the 20th century has created a category of men who were truly outcasts, belonging to no internationally recognizable community whatever, the refugees and stateless people, who indeed cannot be held politically responsible for anything. Politically, regardless of their group or individual character, they are the absolutely innocent ones, and it is precisely this absolute innocence that condemns them to a position outside, as it were, of mankind as a whole. If there were such a thing as collective, namely vicarious, guilt, this would be the case of collective, namely vicarious, innocence. Actually, they are the only totally non-responsible people, and while we usually think of responsibility, especially collective responsibility, as a burden and even as a kind of punishment, I think it can be shown that the price paid for collective non-responsibility is considerably higher. What I am driving at here is a sharper dividing line between political collective responsibility on one side and moral and or legal personal guilt on the other. And what I have chiefly in mind are those frequent cases in which moral and political considerations and moral and political standards of conduct come into conflict. The main difficulty in discussing these matters seems to lie in the very disturbing ambiguity of the words we use in discussions of these issues, to wit, morality or ethics. Both words mean originally no more than customs or manners, and then, in an elevated sense, the customs and manners that are most appropriate for the citizen. From the Nicomachean Ethics to Cicero, ethics or morals were part of politics, that part that dealt not with the institutions but with the citizen, and all the virtues in Greece or in Rome are definitely political virtues. The question is never whether an individual is good, but whether his conduct is good for the world he lives in. In the center of interest is the world, and not the self. When we talk about moral questions, including the question of conscience, we mean something altogether different, something, as a matter of fact, for which we don't have a ready-made word. On the other hand, since we use these ancient words in our discussions, this very old and very different connotation is always present. There is one exception where moral considerations in our sense can be detected in a classical text, and that is the Socratic proposition, "It is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong," which I shall have to discuss in a moment. Before doing so, I would like to mention another difficulty which comes from the opposite side, as it were, namely from the side of religion. That moral matters concern such a thing as the well-being of a soul rather than that of the world is of course part and parcel of the Hebrew Christian heritage. If, for instance, to give the most common example from Greek antiquity, in Aeschylus, Orestes kills his mother upon the strict command of Apollo, and is then nevertheless haunted by the Irenaeus, it is the order of the world that has twice been disturbed and must be restored. Orestes did the right thing when he avenged the death of his father and killed his mother, and still he was guilty, because he had violated another taboo, as we would say today. The tragedy is that only an evil deed can pay back the original crime, and the solution, as we all know, is brought about by Athena, or rather by the foundation of a tribunal, which from now on will take it upon itself to maintain the right order and lift the curse of an unending chain of evil doing, which was necessary to maintain the order of the world. It is the Greek version of the Christian insight that every resisting of the evil done in the world necessarily entails some implication in evil, and the solution of the predicament for the individual. With the rise of Christianity, the emphasis shifted entirely from care for the world and the duties connected with it to care for the soul and its salvation. In the early centuries, the polarization of the two was absolute. The epistles in the New Testament are full of recommendations to shun public, political involvement, and to mind one's own strictly private business, caring for one's soul, until Tertullian summed up this attitude, nec ulla magis res aliena quam publica. No matter is more alien to us than what matters publicly. What we even today understand by moral standards and prescriptions has this Christian background. It is still in the line of this thinking that Mr. Feinberg claims stricter standards of culpability in the moral, as distinguished from the legal point of view. In present-day thinking about these matters, the standards of strictness are obviously the highest for moral matters, the lowest for matters of custom and manners, whereas legal standards are somewhere in between. My point here is that morality owes this high position in our hierarchy of values to its religious origin, whether the divine law prescribing the rules of human conduct was understood to be directly revealed as in the Ten Commandments, or indirectly, as in natural law notions, is of no importance in this context. The rules were absolute because of their divine origin, and their sanctions consisted in future rewards and punishments. It is more than doubtful that these originally religiously rooted rules of conduct can survive the loss of faith in their origin, and especially the loss of transcendent sanctions. John Adams, in a strangely prophetic way, predicted that this loss would make murder as indifferent as shooting plover, and the extermination of the Rohilla nation as innocent as the swallowing of mites on a morsel of cheese. As far as I can see, there are but two of the 10 Commandments to which we still feel morally bound, the Thou shalt not kill, and the Thou shalt not bear false witness. And these two have recently been quite successfully challenged by Hitler and Stalin, respectively. In the center of moral considerations of human conduct stands the self. In the center of political considerations of conduct stands the world. If we strip moral imperatives of their religious connotations and origins, we are left with the Socratic proposition, "It is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong," and its strange substantiation, "For it is better for me to be at odds with the whole world than, being one, to be at odds with myself." However we may interpret this invocation of the axiom of non-contradiction in moral matters as though the one and the same imperative, thou shalt not contradict yourself, is axiomatic for logics and ethics, which, incidentally, is still Kant's chief argument for the categorical imperative, one thing seems clear. The presupposition is that I live together not only with others, but also with myself, and that this togetherness, as it were, has precedence over all others. The political answer to the Socratic proposition would be, what is important in the world is that there be no wrong. Suffering wrong and doing wrong are equally bad. Never mind who suffers it, your duty is to prevent it. Or, to invoke for brevity's sake another famous saying, this time of Machiavelli, who precisely for this reason wanted to teach princes how not to be good. Writing about Florentine patriots who had dared to defy the Pope, he praised them because they had shown how much higher they placed their city than their souls. Where religious language speaks of the soul, secular language speaks of the self. There are many ways in which political and moral standards of conduct can come into conflict with each other, and in political theory they are usually dealt with in connection with the reason of state doctrine and its so-called double standard of morality. We are here concerned with only one special case, with the case of collective and vicarious responsibility, in which the member of a community is held responsible for things he did not participate in, but which were done in his name. Such non-participation can have many causes. The form of government of the country may be such that its inhabitants, or large strata of them, are not admitted to the public realm at all, so that non-participation is not a matter of choice. Or, on the contrary, in free countries, a certain group of citizens may not want to participate, to have anything to do with politics, but not for moral reasons, but simply because they have chosen to take advantage of one of our liberties, the one usually not mentioned when we count our freedoms, because it is so much taken for granted, and that is freedom from politics. This freedom was unknown in antiquity, and has been quite effectively abolished in a number of 20th century dictatorships, especially, of course, in the totalitarian variety. In contrast to absolutism and other forms of tyranny, where non-participation was a matter of course and not of choice, we deal here with a situation where participation, and that, as we know, can mean complicity in criminal activities, is a matter of course, and non-participation a matter of decision. And we have finally the case in free countries where non-participation is actually a form of resistance, as in the case of those who refused to be drafted into the war in Vietnam. This resistance is often argued on moral grounds, but so long as there is freedom of association, and with it the hope that resistance in the form of refusal to participate will bring about a change of policy, it is essentially political. What is in the center of consideration is not the self. I don't go because I don't want to dirty my hands, which of course may also be a valid argument, but the fate of the nation and its conduct toward other nations in the world. Non-participation in the political affairs of the world has always been open to the reproach of irresponsibility, of shirking one's duties toward the world we share with one another and the community we belong to. And this reproach is by no means successfully countered if non-participation is argued on moral grounds. We know from recent experiences that active and sometimes heroic resistance to evil governments comes much rather from men and women who participated in them than from outsiders who were innocent of any guilt. This is true, as a rule with exceptions, for the German resistance against Hitler, and is even truer for the few cases of rebellion against communist regimes. Hungary and Czechoslovakia are cases in point. Otto Kirchheimer, discussing these matters from a legal viewpoint in his book Political Justice, rightly stressed that for the question of legal or moral innocence, namely absence of any complicity in crimes committed by a regime, active resistance would be an illusory yardstick, withdrawal from significant participation in public life, ... willingness to disappear into oblivion and obscurity is a standard which may be rightfully imposed by those sitting in judgment. Page 331 and following. By the same token, though, he somehow justifies those defendants who said that their sense for responsibility did not permit them to choose this way, that they served in order to prevent worse, etc. Arguments which, to be sure, in the case of the Hitler regime sounded rather absurd, and indeed usually were not much more than hypocritical rationalizations of an ardent desire to pursue one's career. But that is another matter. True is that the non-participants were not resistors, in that they did not believe that their attitude had any political consequences. What the moral argument, which I quoted in the form of the Socratic proposition, actually says is about the following. If I would do what is now demanded of me as the price of participation, either as mere conformism or even as the only chance of eventually successful resistance, I could no longer live with myself. My life would cease to be worthwhile for me. Hence, I much rather suffer wrong now, and even pay the price of a death penalty, in case I am forced to participate, than do wrong and then have to live together with such a wrongdoer. If it is a question of killing, the argument would not be that the world would be better off without the murder being done, but the unwillingness to live with an assassin. This argument, it seems to me, is unanswerable from even the strictest political point of view, but it is clearly an argument which can be valid only in extreme, that is, in marginal situations. It is often such situations which are most apt to bring clarification into otherwise rather obscure and equivocal matters. The marginal situation in which moral propositions become absolutely valid in the realm of politics is impotence. Powerlessness, which always presupposes isolation, is a valid excuse for doing nothing. The trouble with this argument is, of course, that it is entirely subjective. Its authenticity can be demonstrated only by the willingness to suffer. There are no general rules, as in legal proceedings, which could be applied and which would be valid for all. But this, I am afraid, will be the bale of all moral judgments which are not supported by or derived from religious commands. Socrates, as we know, was never able to prove his proposition, and Kant's categorical imperative, the only competitor as a strictly non-religious and non-political moral prescription, cannot be proved either. The even deeper trouble with the argument is that it is applicable only to people who are used to live explicitly also with themselves, which is only another way of saying that its validity will be plausible only to men who have a conscience. And the prejudices of jurisprudence that so often in perplexity appeals to conscience as something every sane man must have notwithstanding, the evidence is that quite a number of men have it, but by no means all, and that those who have it can be found in all walks of life and, more specifically, on all degrees of education and non-education. No objective sign of social or educational standing can assure its presence or absence. The only activity that seems to correspond to these secular moral propositions, and to validate them, is the activity of thinking, which, in its most general, entirely non-specialized sense, can be defined with Plato as the silent dialogue between me and myself. If applied to matters of conduct, the faculty of imagination would be involved in such thought to a high degree, that is, the ability to represent, to make present to myself what is still absent, any contemplated deed. To what extent this faculty of thought, which is exercised in solitude, extends into the strictly political sphere, where I am always together with others, is another question. But whatever our answer to this question, hopefully to be answered by political philosophy, might turn out to be, no moral, individual, and personal standards of conduct will ever be able to excuse us from collective responsibility. This vicarious responsibility for things we have not done, this taking upon ourselves the consequences for things we are entirely innocent of, is the price we pay for the fact that we live our lives not by ourselves, but among our fellowmen, and that the faculty of action, which, after all, is the political faculty par excellence, can be actualized only in one of the many and manifold forms of human community. Hannah Arendt, who was born in 1906 and died in 1975 at the age of 69 by a heart attack, was one of the most controversial and influential philosophers and political theorists of the 20th century. She studied under Heidegger at the University of Marburg and completed her PhD in 1929 under Karl Jaspers at the University of Heidelberg. She was Jewish, which makes her affair with Heidegger particularly interesting. Heidegger was a Nazi, and after experiencing imprisonment in Germany, she fled to Paris and then New York in 1941, becoming a U.S. citizen in 1950. She taught at many schools, including Notre Dame, Berkeley, Princeton, UChicago, and the New School, avoiding tenure-track jobs and declining to be referred to as a philosopher. She is the author, of course, of The Origins of Totalitarianism, one of the most important works in political philosophy in the 20th century, Eichmann in Jerusalem, whence we get the phrase, the banality of evil, On Revolution, and many other incredible works, and she is one of my personal idols. Her mind is incredible, insightful, and her works, written many decades ago, are so deeply applicable for our society today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this great essay. The goal, the end, the telos of AristotleWalks is to make philosophy, in particular ancient, but also contemporary, more accessible. In creating this channel, I am thinking about serious students of philosophy who are auditory learners like me. I'm thinking about people who are interested in philosophy, but reading dense papers is a bit too much. I hope that listening to them is something one can approach lightheartedly. I'm thinking about students considering the study of philosophy or in the beginnings of their journey who do not know to which papers they should turn. Here I will highlight the best papers, the most influential papers, the ones you should probably read first. To do this, I'm getting help from my mentors and friends, some of whom are the leading scholars in the field of philosophy today. Finally, and most importantly, I am thinking about students with vision impairments. I think that it is a huge problem that many fields of work, including but actually particularly academia, is so inaccessible for students with disabilities. My aim is to make philosophy accessible. I hope to build AristotleWalks into a helpful resource for a variety of learners. The YouTube channel AristotleWalks is a counterpart, an antistrophos, to my original Instagram account AristotleWalks, where I post excerpts of Aristotle's works daily. I would appreciate it if you followed it and/or subscribed to this channel. Thank you, and I hope you have a lovely day.